For millennia, technological innovation crawled forward at a snail's pace. The Industrial Revolution dramatically sped up the pace of change and created a small middle class whose lives were significantly improved. But for the average person, life remained the same or got worse. Let's take a look at American society in 1915, after another wave of technological innovations called the Second Industrial Revolution. Most people lived in cities whose streets were crowded with horse-drawn carriages and pedestrians. Only a few households could afford cars, and paved roads were rare. Despite the invention of electricity, most homes were still lit by candles or oil. Even with the invention of numerous machines, the average laborer worked over 55 hours a week, and most women stayed at home. And less than 25% of youth were enrolled in high school. The majority were working instead. In fact, the word teenager didn't even exist. As this cartoon suggests, the United States was mostly a regional power focused on controlling Latin America. Fast forward to 1945 and life was looking a lot different. Almost all households had electricity. Most families had at least one car, and paved roads crisscrossed the nation. The average laborer worked 40 hours a week. Many more women were in the workforce. Most of the youth were enrolled in high school. And the American teenager was born. The United States was part of the Big Three, which was made up of Russia, Britain, and the US. As this cartoon suggests, being in this group meant you were now one of the world's most powerful nations. These changes took place during a few decades that were characterized by three major global events: World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. In today's lesson, we are going to look into the ways these events drove shifts in economic policy and the consequences of those shifts. The guiding questions are: how did World War I change the American economy? How did the Great Depression and New Deal change the federal government's role in the domestic economy? And how did World War II change the American economy? The lesson's essential question is: how did World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression shape the American economy? Let's go. Throughout the video, you will see one of these charts. Whenever you see one, pause the video and go to that chart in the guided viewing. Beside each chart, jot down the impact that these events had on the US economy. The first major shift occurred with the outbreak of World War I in Europe. During the war, European nations needed more weapons and more food for their war effort, which increased demand for United States goods. And how do you think this impacted the economy? From 1913 to 1917, the U.S. nearly tripled its exports to Europe. European demand for the U.S. goods made unemployment rates fall significantly because American industries hired more and more people in order to meet the demand. This transformed U.S. companies from mostly domestic suppliers of industrial goods into global suppliers, which led to more jobs for the average American. But it was not until the United States officially entered World War I that the federal government's role in the economy dramatically changed. The government increased its revenue and used the money to buy industrial and military goods to supply the U.S. military. At home, it spent millions on expanding the electric grid, building roads, and funding research into new technologies. Overall, the government's increase in spending during the war meant its share of gross domestic product also increased. Gross domestic product refers to the total value of all goods produced by an economy in a year. A higher government share of GDP indicates a greater level of government spending and involvement in the economy. For example, World War I made the federal government's share of gross domestic product rise from 2.3% in 1915 to a staggering 25% in 1919. This meant that the federal government went from having almost no presence in the economy to being responsible for a fourth of all economic activity. Since World War I, government spending has driven the nation's gross domestic product, making government a major economic industry in the modern world. In the long term, World War I enlarged the American economy's global position. No longer on the sidelines, the U.S. became a financially robust nation, becoming one of the world's leading economies. It also shifted the balance of economic power from war-torn Europe to a thriving industrial America. And the expanded infrastructure and new industries altered the average American's daily life. Time for the first guiding question. How did World War I change America's economy? The death and destruction of World War I caused a political shift back to isolationism, limiting economic growth. Government spending, which had soared during the war, temporarily returned to pre-war levels. However, the government's investments in infrastructure and technology led to new consumer goods. For example, an expanded electrical grid made new electrical appliances, such as refrigerators, possible. A new consumer economy was coupled with soaring stock prices. But when those stock prices declined in 1929, the whole economy came crashing down. Between 1930 and 1932, 4 major banking panics rocked the United States, causing people to pull their money from banks across the country. Industrial production and gross domestic product collapsed. Unemployment soared to record levels. The Great Depression had arrived. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the New Deal, a series of government programs aimed at reviving the economy and providing relief to those affected. The New Deal caused government spending to increase again, dramatically changing the federal government's peacetime involvement in the domestic economy. To tackle unemployment, the federal government created numerous agencies designed to put people back to work. Through these agencies, the federal government produced cultural works such as art projects, theater companies, and musical performances, built electrical dams, hospitals, and schools, and employed young people in the expansion and renovation of the national parks system. These different projects increased the government's share of gross domestic product back to World War I levels. The Great Depression and New Deal made the federal government one of the largest employers and consumers in the economy. This was unheard of in a peacetime economy. Another major impact of these agencies was it put millions of people back to work, which helped decrease the unemployment rate by 5%. In the process, the federal government helped to relieve much of the early suffering caused by the Great Depression. The New Deal also went after fraud and other business practices that hurt the economy and workers. It created the Security and Exchange Commission to oversee the stock market and banks. And it passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, regulating work hours, conditions, and pay. These new regulations meant the federal government was not just an employer and consumer in the economy, but also a regulator of economic activity. The Great Depression and New Deal expanded the federal government's power to regulate economic activity, normalizing government involvement in businesses and people's lives. Despite the federal government's efforts, the Great Depression dragged on, but once again, a world war created numerous more economic opportunities and growth. Before we pull that curtain back, let's answer the next guiding question. How did the Great Depression and New Deal change the federal government's role in the domestic economy? Even before the United States declared war on Japan and Germany, its economy had begun shifting to a war economy. The Lend-Lease Act further increased federal spending by funding military supplies to the Allied powers. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor, federal spending reached levels unseen before the attack. The War Production Board was established to coordinate the massive increase in federal spending, converting most of the nation's companies into a single war industry. By 1945, the federal government accounted for almost half of the nation's gross domestic product. This meant the government had become one of the largest consumers in the nation. During World War II, unemployment dropped to a record low of around 1%. This historically low level meant that federal spending was responsible, whether directly or indirectly, for most of the nation's jobs. Technological advancement was a cornerstone of the war effort. Aviation soared to new heights. The U.S. developed the P-51 Mustang, a powerful fighter plane that set the course for post-war aviation innovation. Research for the design of the atomic bomb was used to develop nuclear power plants, which use nuclear energy to create electricity for consumer use. During World War II, the federal government spent billions of dollars on research and development. This led to a spike in new methods and products that remain unmatched in U.S. history. These innovations spurred post-war discoveries and economic growth, which created new industries and jobs. Since the war, the government has continued to be one of the largest funders of technology and science. Okay, so wartime spending had positive peacetime effects, such as funding technologies that would help companies be more productive and profitable. But it also came with a cost for future businesses and taxpayers, namely paying off the federal debt that resulted from increased government spending. During World War II, the federal debt increased by 400%. That's a lot of debt to deal with, which introduced a new type of political debate to American politics, the national debt crisis. In the 1950s, politicians struggled to handle the United States' new role in the economy and world while bringing down the federal debt created during World War II. Before we wrap up, let's answer the final guiding question. How did World War II change the American economy? Unlike the 1920s, the post-World War II period witnessed a United States committed to steering the national and global economy. After initially falling, post-war federal spending has grown ever since World War II, indicating an increasingly active federal government. Just consider how different today is from 1945. Internet, cell phones, superhighways, and satellites, all of these were funded by the federal government. And how do you use these innovations? To keep making history. Hey, hey.